Yes.
Basically start with a brief introduction about how this all started. So basically, we last year started with a global brain consortium project about COVID-induced brain dysfunction. And in general, the global brain consortium is basically bringing together researchers and other clinicians from all around the world. We are trying to tackle basically mental health problems, but also neurological problems, and to backgrounds, so clinicians, but all the basic researchers, neuroimagers, but also more geneticists and all the policymakers to try to improve basically mental health. We all know that during the last years, COVID was basically a major game changer all around the world, and we therefore established this project last year to tackle COVID-induced brain dysfunctions. So basically, COVID-induced brain dysfunctions will very likely cause a strain on the health systems worldwide, and all as a result of the heterogeneity of the manifestations. Because in the end, we are just at the beginning to understand the neurobiological basis, but it's not just the neurobiological influence factors, but we also see psychological, social factors that could play a role. And this is what we are trying to manage or to trying to disentangle. To this end, because we have seen that there are lots of single studies, even studies on a large scale, but lots of these studies are focused on a specific country, on a specific population. So this basically could, and we are trying to bring this data together into the big picture to come up with precision medicine solutions for this, what comes up to the diagnostic, but also in terms of treatment recommendations. So right now, actually, COVID is, well, it's not over, but maybe for the biggest waves are over. So we have seen, and this is data from this week, there are meanwhile over 750 million. Oh, Carlos, is it right? I see here that the breakout room will close in 50 seconds.
I'm looking at it.
Okay, I would just continue and hope everything works fine. So basically, we have 750 million people who were infected and around about 7 million people who are dying. We look at the time frame, we see that actually during the last year or the months, it ebbed off. So the number of new cases, the number of deaths, although decreased dramatically. However, in addition to this acute infections, we still have obviously long-term COVID or long COVID. And we are just starting to understand this. So
Se cayeron todos los rooms.
Yes, we turned off all the rooms because we're recreating them. We're recreating.
All right, I think that.
Okay, they're opening already. Let me know if you can see.
Yeah, no, we can see it.
That's a glitch because we've been seeing these rooms all the time.
Now I see the breakout room. So whatever you did, something.
No, just closed it, created it.
I'm some breakout rooms too. It's a new on the bottom. It's over on the right all the way. It's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, so people can go to them. Hopefully,
they can change from one room to the other as they wish. No, theoretically.
Yeah, looks like it's working now for me at least, and others.
Okay, then I think we can go to the rooms, guys, so we can start. Just pick your room.
Cases over the last years, and now the acute infections are decreasing. However, we still see quite a number of people who complain about symptoms or who experience symptoms who are commonly referred to as long COVID. That is, these are continuing symptoms that are maintained even 3 months after the acute infection is basically over. And what we are mostly interested in is basically neural or brain changes, because in the end, we're a great or increasing concern is that the COVID pandemic will now basically lead to a second wave, so to a secular pandemic of neurodegenerative diseases, which could basically put a health strain on the mental health systems for quite a number of years in the years to come. So we were mainly interested in, as a brain, COVID-induced brain dysfunction working group, in cognitive impairments like and also fatigue, psychopathology, emotional dysregulation, and although probably the underlying brain structural and functional changes. Therefore, in 2021, we met for the first time with, although here in the Global Brain Consortium, we had speakers here from the larger COVID brain projects, for instance, from Maastricht, but also from the UK. We had all of the people from the Cuban Brain Project here who will also speak today and present their result. And at this meeting, although it became quite obvious that we see changes on not brain function, but cognitive and brain functional changes in the patient. So for instance, these are two very nice and very solid and well-conducted studies from Eden, Hampshire, who could show that during the acute phase, we actually see very strong cognitive deficits, particularly in higher order or cognitive functions. And although in long-term and in large studies, so in the UK intelligence study, we could show that even during the chronic phase, so after several months after the disorder, after the acute infection went down, these cognitive deficits are maintained in a number of people. And we've also seen that brain structural changes seem to be quite obvious. So we have meanwhile quite a number of studies that could show, for instance, this long-term study from Steve Smith's group in Oxford could show that brain structure decreased, or the cortical thickness decreased after the disorder. Whereas although some other studies, for instance, from Barrett Biswald's group could show that we see all those subcortical changes, which at least are correlated with fatigue symptoms. Obviously, this is often not very causal data. So if we look at the more complex picture, we actually see that these COVID-induced brain dysfunction, all these cognitive deficits, could actually reflect a mixture of actual influencing factors that include not just direct action of the virus in the brain, but it could also be secondary changes, like, for instance, pathological changes in the blood-brain barrier. It could be also, and this is probably not so strongly in the focus until now, it could be psychological mechanisms, like, for instance, acute stress or the chronic stress increase via these long-term strains over the COVID. Then we have social factors, for instance, like social isolation or social pressure. If changes in the lifestyle and all of this together could basically accumulate to brain changes and to cognitive deficits. The question is now, how can we disentangle this? And this would be very important to disentangle, because it although informs how these people will be treated. So probably stress-related deficits will require different treatment than actual virus-related changes. And so it is definitely very important to subtype these people and to drag apart these different influential factors. We started this now over the last 2 years and could see that, for instance, although, for instance, social isolation or loneliness, which during these prolonged lockdowns, in particular, maybe in the older population, could have an impact. So we could see that there are cognitive changes related to chronic loneliness and chronic social isolation, and all the brain changes related to this. Another influential factor could be, for instance, early life stress. So particularly long-term stress. We know that long-term stress is particularly bad for, or has impact on cognitive function and also on the structure and the functional architecture of the brain. The question is now although that particularly probably the young developing brain is particularly sensitive for stress-induced changes, which can also be maintained into adulthood. We have seen that during this time, we also see changes in the lifestyle, and therefore I'm also happy to have Professor Christian Montag here today, because we've also seen that during this pandemic, an increasing number of people engaged excessively in internet-related applications or in digital media. And we've seen in quite a number of studies that excessive use of these mechanisms is related to brain structural and functional changes, and also probably to cognitive changes. Furthermore, what is very important to move forward are basically scalable diagnostic measures. Therefore, maybe MRI is not the method of choice, and maybe a mixture of cognitive tests with quantitative EEG measures, like it's, for instance, currently also developed by Pedro Valdez group. It might be a very good screening instrument to really see which are causal mechanisms, and can we do these causal mechanisms basically contribute to identifying those in need for further treatment. Furthermore, we also have technical challenges. So for instance, this is a study from Zhou Qingqi from the last year, where you could show that if you use different pipelines for processing brain structural data and look at very simple and very clear, but we thought very clear questions, like for instance, age-related changes or gender differences, we actually see totally different brain regions depending on the brain, depending on the software that is used. So this also indicates that we first need very well harmonized and well-validated pipelines to actually make conclusions about which brain region is affected by COVID, because you can imagine if already the different pipelines for processing the data stronger contribute to which regions are identified, then these regions are probably not very solid biomarkers. So we also need harmonized protocols and very specific, maybe more multivariate methods to really generate a very clear and also a very robust pattern that we can interpret in terms of biological markers. And finally, what we are currently working on is trying to build up an Enigma-style working group, which basically brings together original data from all of these studies that I've showed before, and also from currently published studies. We have quite a number of data sets that, particularly on brain structure, that are published, but lots of these studies are small. They are acquired in a very specific population, and it would be very good to have a large-scale data set where, although it is finally possible via mediation analysis, for instance, or although via accounting for different influence factors like stress, like although gender differences and so on, it is possible to hopefully generate really valid biomarkers that are generally interpretable. So based on this, I'm very happy to have speakers here today that basically all go in this direction. So we have Christian Montag here, who will speak about the technological use during COVID and how this can contribute to brain changes. We have Roberto and Joel here, who will both speak about the COVID longitudinal project, which basically is a large-scale project that followed people up over the long term and hopefully can generate, although causal mechanisms, what changes in the brain. We have Yukin here, who will speak about quantitative EEG as a potential marker that is also scalable for diagnostic intervention. We have Winnie Tso here, who will speak about COVID and the young brain, because this is also a particularly interesting feature. How does COVID influence, or how do COVID-related long-term changes develop in vulnerable populations like very young people or also in the elderly? Ben Kluger-Brown will talk about the effect of mask wearing, which was a very long discussion actually. And Daniel Scharfenberg will speak about the cognitive impairments and probably also about the long-term effects to see how long this develops. So I'm quite very much looking forward to your talks now.
Hold on, so I hope you can see my slides and also you hear my voice. That's excellent. So thank you so much, Ben, for bringing this together. It's wonderful to see you all. And I try to make this rather short and to be on time. I speak today about the COVID pandemic and technological use disorders, and I will use an effective neuroscience theory framework to better understand what happened over the last years. And if I refer to Ben Becker's introduction, clearly I will focus on psychological mechanisms which impact clearly also in feedback functions on our brains resonate there. And I try to shed some light on how technology might have impacted our brains. So let me start rather easy. What are technological or internet use disorders? You might rather know the term internet addiction, which was on vogue for a lot of years, but in the meanwhile, we have switched terminologies and speak of internet use disorders. And in this field, it is really important to distinguish between generalized internet use disorders and more specific versions. So to make this rather short, if we speak of generalized internet use disorders, this would encompass patient groups which have not a problem in a single area, such as gaming, but they might also have problems in regulating their social media use or other areas. And in diagnostics, it's really important to understand in which areas the problems arise. And there are, of course, also patient groups which only have problems in single areas, such as gaming or gambling. At the moment, only gaming and gambling disorder are officially recognized by the World Health Organization as distinct disorders, and the remaining areas, which you can see here, are a matter of discussion at the moment. And it's pretty fiercely discussed if, for instance, social media or social networks use disorder is actually an own distinct disorder, or if this comes too early at the moment. If you want to understand how we diagnose gaming disorder in the field, which again is included in the ICD-11, you have to see across a time frame of 12 months, basically these 4 criteria, namely loss of control over the behavior. The gamers want to reduce, but they don't manage to do. They keep on with gaming despite negative consequences. Just think of someone who spends up the whole night with a video game and sleeps over an important exam. And what does she learn from it? Nothing, just keeps on with the behavior. Then priority is an important critical symptom, namely that everything focuses around the gaming and everything else which was of importance not happening anymore. And finally, in order not to over-pathologize everyday life behavior, we need to see functional impairments. So the gaming behavior is so excessive that it has negative consequences for a more romantic relationship or your job and so forth, so that we have a certain amount of gravity regarding the behavior. The World Health Organization foresees that these problems can arise in the online and offline context, or a mixed version, but clearly we will target today the most prevalent area, namely the internet gaming disorder. By the way, this is also a term which has been put forward earlier in the DSM-5, where it is a research diagnosis, and only in the framework of the World Health Organization, gaming disorder is officially recognized. So the question, of course, is, was there a rise of internet use disorders due to the pandemic? What you see here is a preprint from my group, where we asked people, how did your internet use change due to COVID-19? And it's pretty clear that for most of the people, the change was towards a strong increase. So only a few people said, while the pandemic, that actually got less. So for most people, it stayed the same or was getting way higher. And we know that this is a risk factor by itself, because if people spend more time online, at least a few of them, which are vulnerable, are more at risk at developing technological use disorders. And this is also what we observed in our data. This is cross-sectional data, so don't let me be blinded. So there's no causality. But in our model, we observed that higher changes in internet use towards more were associated with lower well-being, and this was mediated by compulsive internet use, hence internet use disorders, which probably also developed across the pandemic. Here, what you can see is data from our platform called doiplaytoomuchvideogames.com, where we collected over the years over nearly 200,000 data sets. And what you see here are not the same people who repeatedly answered a questionnaire. So these are just distinct persons who happened to be on our platform in 2019, 20, or 21. But what you can see here in this different cohorts, which we investigated, is that both gaming disorder or internet gaming disorder, either assessed with the WHO framework or the DSM-5 framework, that we see a strong rise in gaming disorder tendencies across the years. So, and this fits pretty well in what we have seen in the literature. This is a review by the group around Mark Griffith, and what you can see here, that in particular for the behavior addictions in the area of food addiction, gaming addiction, social media addiction, we have seen higher prevalence rates while the pandemic was going on compared to before the pandemic or non-lockdown periods. And this shows a bit that internet use disorders seems to be on the rise also due to the pandemic. So why was there an increase? And I think here Jaak Panksepp's effective neuroscience theory can help a bit. Guess most of the people are familiar with the theory, so I'll make it short. Jaak carved out 7 primary emotional systems via different neuroscientific methods when he was studying the mammalian brain. And he came up with 7 subcortically rooted primary emotional systems, which have been homogeneously conserved across the mammalian brains because they have important evolutionary functions. For instance, there's a play circuit, and we know that all mammals need to play when they are young because this fosters social competencies and motoric skills. Or all the mammals have a sadness system, which is triggered, for example, by separation distress. And the pandemic in particular, also the fear circuit was important because a lot of people feared to get infected by COVID or other areas such as fearing job loss. And I'd like to just shortly stress to the idea that disbalances in these subcortically rooted systems pave the way for developing affective disorders. We have seen this in many studies. This is a questionnaire study where we applied Panksepp's framework. And what you see here when you, for example, contrast depressed persons and healthy control participants, that depressed persons are associated with more fear, with more sadness, with lower play and lower seeking tendencies. So supporting the idea that disbalances in these primary emotional circuits, again, rooted in ancient areas of the brain, these disbalances are at the core of understanding affective disorders. And these are pre-pandemic data. We have already established links between these primary emotional systems with internet use disorders, and it comes not as a surprise that in particularly the negative primary emotional systems are robustly associated with internet use disorders in our work. Let's go back to the pandemic. So what we observed in the pandemic is that as a consequence, governments around the world put in charge lockdown, social distancing, and closed daycare procedures, which had a profound effect on families around the world. So I know this myself. I'm a father of 2 children, and when daycare was closed, it means that we had to juggle somehow the work and the care for the children across the day, which was pretty stressful. And as a consequence, we couldn't care as good as we wanted for our offspring. And a lot of parents clearly also were frustrated, which is associated with anger. They were fearing job loss or fearing getting infected. So they had a lot of negative effect, and we saw spillover effects with the children, so that children were sad that they couldn't interact with their parents. They could not outlive their play tendencies as they should have, as they needed. They had not enough opportunities to explore the world. And so far, disbalances in primary emotional systems were, of course, a likely consequence of the COVID pandemic, which also explains why I've seen a rise in affective disorders around the world. We carried out studies where we invited people, which we invested earlier, who were at Ulm University in psychiatry, and they were getting treatment for depression. And while the pandemic was going on, we asked them about their fear of COVID as a central as a central construct to understand negative effect in the pandemic. And what we also observed when we recontacted former inpatients and healthy controls is that, first of all, those who were treated for depression and were not in psychiatry anymore still showed higher fear of COVID-19 and depression severity compared to the controls. And in particular, depression diagnosis, then significant life events, negative, of course, critical life events, depression severity were before the pandemic were significant positive predictors of fear of COVID. And as a buffer against fear of COVID was high play scores. So those people who had high positive effect, these were more likely not to have higher fear of COVID tendencies. We also did some studies in China trying to understand who would be in particularly prone to develop higher anxiety and fear of COVID. And in this analysis, we observed that were in particular people who reported to score high on stress and rumination. Let's come back to our topic, technological use disorders. So the question is, of course, is health anxiety or fear of COVID, is this associated with more problematic smartphone use and gaming disorder tendencies? This was indeed the case. So we have observed that there are robust associations. And the question is a bit, why are there these associations between fearing COVID and overusing technologies? And one of the critical theories in the field is that this has to do with self-medication. So people have disbalances in their primary emotional circuits, and in order to forget everything about their own negative effects, they start to spend more time online to just forget about the miseries. And this could explain why we have seen such associations. And we have seen such associations immediately in the beginning of the pandemic, where we investigated data from Tianjin, where we observed robust associations between fear of COVID and overuse of smartphones. And this association was mediated by...
You have 1 minute more.
Thank you. I will be then finished.
Thank you.
This could be explained by a social media addiction scale, which clearly happens to be an important activity on the smartphones. So this brings me nearly to the end. The question is a bit, okay, do people who live through psychological distress in longitudinal data then develop more addictive tendencies towards, for example, social media? And interestingly, this seems not to be the case, which at least a bit speaks overall the general self-medication theory. We have seen that these longitudinal data are more like trait-like driven. So we have probably to more take a look at traits which drive the stable correlations between, for example, distress and overuse or well-being of in the pandemic. But this is still ongoing research, and still I think that the self-medication hypothesis of importance. And this brings me nearly to the end. We don't know nearly nothing at all over technological use disorders and fear of COVID on a brain level. There have been no studies which I know until this day which have combined these areas. And also the technological use disorder complex with smartphone overuse is pretty much under-researched. We did a recent review, and for instance, there is not even one longitudinal study trying to shed light on actual changes due to overusing the smartphone. So thank you so much for listening to me, and also to my cooperation partners, for Benjamin and also John Elhai from the University of Toledo.
Okay.
I think, Pedro, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here.
Maybe because all of these three parts are part of one larger project from Cuba, longitudinal. Can you maybe say 2 sentences about the general outline? Because I think then it's better understandable.
Okay, so at the
Just 2 or 3 sentences about the design and general aim of this big project.
Okay, so this is data that's a bit unique for the following reason. At the beginning of the pandemic, everybody in Cuba who had that was let's say possible COVID, until he had a PCR test, was put for free in a medical installation. They were, they were given us food, but they were isolated. Now, when the diagnosis came, and these are people who were very much in close contact, people that were not PCR positive went back home. The other ones stayed until the symptoms disappeared. No, so months afterwards, these two samples from each of these groups was analyzed from the psychological, neurological. It was a full battery, psychiatric point of view, and then what happened was that EEG was carried out. So that was let's say the scalable measure that was used. So the results from the longitudinal study in Cuba are precisely these. They are the results that are being analyzed in different ways by different participants. So that's the introduction, Ben.
All right, thanks. I think that now it's clearer for the audience, Oda. Do you want to take over?
Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Yukin and the PhD students work with Pedro in China. And today I'm going to talk about how the severity of COVID-19 affect the brain and the mental health of patients who recovered from the infection. This is work from our group and Pedro, Maria, Flynn, Shawa, and me. So COVID-19 is a serious disease that can cause not only the respiratory and physical problem, but also neuropsychiatric symptoms that might last for a long time after the infection. These symptoms including anxiety, depression, fatigue, insomnia, and some cognitive impairment. However, it is not clear how these symptoms are related to the severity of COVID-19 and what role the brain plays in this process. Therefore, we conducted a study to explore the causal chain between these variables using a counterfactual-based mediation analysis. So we use the data from a 3 months post-COVID study of 2021 in Havana. It has 178 Cuban subjects who were divided into 2 groups. 91 patients who had COVID-19, it means PCR positive, and 87 patients who did not have COVID-19. We also classified the COVID-19 patients according to their degree of severity, divided into asymptomatic, mild symptomatic, and severe symptomatic. So for our preliminary results work with our group, we obtained a latent variable for the pre-health condition by atom response theory, as these are yes or no questions, a binary value like a score. And we found the age and the PHC will affect the severity of COVID-19 patients. Additionally, people with a history of any priori health condition will have a substantial risk to getting severe COVID, eventually resulting in more neuropsychiatric symptoms. So with this preliminary result, we got a hypothesis. The brain state will as a mediator between infection and post-neuropsychiatric symptoms. So we conducted this mediation model, use the severity of COVID-19 as the exposure and post-neuropsychiatric symptom as the outcome and brain state as the mediator. Also, we follow the preliminary results, use the age, gender, THC, what we got before, as the confounding variables. And the neuropsychiatric symptoms, it has been assessed by using a standards interview called Schedules for Clinical Assessment in Neuropsychiatric Symptoms, as called as SCAN, the version 2.1. This interview covered various domains such as psycho health, somatoform disorder, anxiety, depression, thinking, concentration, something like this. Then we do a count for each category, and then we got 14 items like pain, autonomic, and some newer things. So we also measure the brain activity using the EEG. We obtain the 8 minutes of racing state EEG data for each subject using a 21-channel digital system based on the 1020 system. So then we processed the EEG data using a toolbox called harmonized QEEG to get a quantitative EEG feature which fully reflected the brain state. Because of the highly relation between the brain state and psychiatry, we use the canonical correlation analysis to create latent variable by combining QEEG with the scan scores. We found this is the factor we found the factor post-neuropsychiatric symptom. This factor is mainly expressed in symptoms which related to the neurological, like the anatomic, the pain, the neuroses, but except the sexual dysfunction, the panic symptoms is not being real in this part. And then this is the latent variable of QEEG. It has been highly loaded for all frequency bands. For location part, the activity of occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and the frontal lobe all have been loaded, but for temporal lobe has not been loaded well. So then we performed a mediation analysis model, which we conducted before. And from the results of the mediation analysis, showed that the mediation effect was very significant, meaning that the brain state mediated the effect of COVID-19 severity on post-COVID neuropsychiatric symptoms. However, the direct effect were not significant. That means there was no direct effect of COVID-19 severity on post-neuropsychiatric symptoms after accounting for the brain state. Moreover, the last column of the last row, the proportion of the mediation effect was very significant. It indicates that most of the effect of COVID-19 severity on post-neuropsychiatric symptom was explained by the brain state. And this mediation analysis is a fully mediation effect. And then we performed a sensitive analysis to check how robust our results were to potential unmeasured confounder. We found that our results were robust and unlikely to be affected by other unmeasured factors. So to do a summary, we found that the brain state mediates most of the effect of COVID-19 severity on post-COVID neuropsychiatric symptoms. This suggests that COVID-19 may affect mental health by directly affecting brain function. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. Now we can try to reproduce. We can continue with Whitney's law. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Are you there, Whitney?
Yes,
I am.
I think
Yes.
we already started sharing the screen. So thanks very much for coming, and please, we are looking forward to a talk.
Right. So thank you for giving me the chance to share my work on how COVID affects the young brain. So we all know that COVID-19 has been associated with several neurological complications. In the adult population, we have adults that have been affected with stroke or immune-mediated disorders. In children, we also see cases with Guillain-Barré syndrome, autoimmune encephalitis, or acute necrotizing encephalitis. Apart from the acute stage of COVID-19, we found that a large proportion of infected individuals can experience protracted post-viral syndrome following COVID-19. Nowadays, we call it long COVID, which is likely of brain origin, given the dominance of neuropsychiatric symptoms such as fatigue and subjective cognitive difficulties. Now, with the occurrence of physical brain injury being overt in some COVID-19 associated neurological syndromes such as stroke and encephalitis, a number of studies have suggested that brain injury can also occur in the context of COVID-19, even in the absence of a clear concomitant neurological diagnosis. So in this presentation, the first part I would talk about in the acute phase, how children with neuro-COVID might present. And in the second part, I will concentrate on talking about the long-term impact on children from COVID and about how the neuro mechanisms of brain fog. Now, in the acute phase, during the initial of the Omicron outbreak last year, we did a study to study the outcome and neurological complications in unvaccinated hospitalized children during the Omicron BA.2 wave in Hong Kong. So we did a population-based cohort study it's actually during the start of the Omicron outbreak in Hong Kong last year. So we gathered data from the Clinical Data Analysis and Reporting System, which is a Hong Kong territory-wide health registration system, recording admissions of all the public hospitals in Hong Kong. So we gathered data of a total of over 1,000 children aged 0 to 11 years old, which were hospitalized during the 1-month period. And as you can see, majority of them were in the younger age group, age 0 to 5 years old. In terms of mortality, we had 4 death cases among those cases, which include a child of 11 months, 3 years, 4 years, and 9 years old. 3 of them had good past health, whereas the 9-year-old had Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Or were not vaccinated against COVID-19. The cause of death for the 2 cases were attributed to neurological causes, one of them being affected with encephalopathy, the other with a severe form of acute necrotizing encephalitis with fulminant cerebral edema. And 1.8% of the children had severe outcomes requiring intensive care admissions. Whereas in terms of neurological complications, it's also relatively common. 15% of children with neurological complication were hospitalized during the period. The most neurological complication was febrile seizure, followed by seizure with fever. 5 of the kids had COVID-associated encephalitis or encephalopathy. When we compare the risk of COVID-associated severe complications with children infected with influenza and other common respiratory viruses, we found that children infected with COVID had a high risk of seizure with fever compared to children with influenza. And compared with children infected with parainfluenza, we find that the risk of seizure with fever and encephalopathy or encephalitis is higher in children infected with COVID. And we also did a case series looking at the neurological manifestation and the risk factors of children with neuro-COVID. And we found that we actually studied the cerebrospinal fluid of 7 of these children out of the 15. And we found that, interestingly, all of them were negative for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And children with neurological manifestation, other than simple febrile convulsion, had higher risk of residual neurological deficits. And in children with COVID febrile illnesses, we found that in terms of the blood and CSF neuroinflammatory markers, such as interleukin-6, it's found to be higher than children with febrile illness due to other causes. So in terms of the long-term impact of COVID-19 on the young brain, so recently, the World Health Organization had come up with a definition. So post-COVID-19 condition in children and adolescents have been defined as it occurs in individuals with a history of confirmed or probable infection when experiencing symptoms lasting at least for 2 months, which initially occur within 3 months of acute COVID-19. And the symptoms generally have an impact on the everyday functioning. And many studies had highlighted the wide range of long COVID symptoms in children and adolescents. But from this slide, we can see that neurological symptoms can be quite prominent, such as difficulty thinking or concentrating. They suffer from headaches, sleep problem, dizziness, pins and needle sensation, changes in smell or taste, depression or anxiety symptoms. And in terms of the long COVID prevalence in children, there's a wide range of prevalence rates ranging from 5 to 50%, mainly due to the wide range of criteria and definition, especially during the start of the COVID pandemic, when there is no sort of an official definition of long COVID in children. So in Hong Kong, we collected some preliminary data on how common is long COVID in the pediatric population, as well as what are the common symptoms in children with long COVID. So although we have already gathered data from close to 1,000 children, these are just preliminary data. So we found that in terms of parent reporting, symptoms such as mood problem, cognitive problem, exercise intolerance, loss of appetite, fatigue, respiratory symptoms are a lot more common in children who had COVID infection compared to control subjects who had not been infected before. And the situation is similar for self-reported symptoms in adolescents, where they commonly suffer from mood problem, cognitive problem, orthostatic intolerance, exercise intolerance, altered taste, loss of smell, loss of appetite, fatigue, and respiratory symptoms. So in terms of the neurocognitive profile of COVID-related brain fog, so we invited close to 100 children now, but these are preliminary data. We look at the cognitive performance between subject with history of SARS-CoV infection and control subjects without history of infection. So we can see that from this table, for subjects with history of COVID infection, they perform worse on the processing speed task. Although there were no significant differences in other neuropsychological testing tasks, there's a trend that subjects with COVID perform worse on the cognitive and executive functioning. And the important question is that whether COVID-19 might lead to brain changes in youngsters, in children or adolescents. Now, as Professor Becker has mentioned in a study published in Nature last year, in the adult and elderly population, the study found that infected participants show an average larger cognitive decline between the 2 time points than in uninfected participants. And more importantly, they found that in infected subjects, they had reduction of gray matter thickness in certain areas of the brain. Now, data in the pediatric population is quite limited. So we invited our cohort of children and adolescents to have diffusion cryptosis imaging as well as fMRI study. And we invited patients, children who have COVID infection versus those who had not been infected before. And from the diagram here, we found that there are significant changes in children who had history of mild COVID infection, especially affecting the anterior corona radiata, the corpus callosum, and the uncinate fasciculus. And these are areas that are related to the frontal lobe of the brain. And interestingly, we also find association between the neurocognitive task and specific regions of the brain. So now, in terms of the neurobiological basis of brain changes or brain fog, so many have attributed to COVID-related neuroinflammation. So our group had designed an animal model, and we look at post-mortem juvenile hamster brain, and we found that
You have
Yes,
1 minute more. Thank you.
right, thank you. And right, thank you. And we found that in juvenile hamster brain, there were actually no evidence of SARS-CoV viruses entering the brain environment. Rather, we actually found astrocyte activation, especially affecting the prefrontal region, which suggests that the signs of neuroinflammation, which might be the cause of the changes of the brain affecting the youngsters. So in terms of recovery, in adult study, we found that, in adult study, it was found that most long COVID symptoms can recover within 3 months. 85% of people who have long COVID symptoms 3 months after being infected can recover completely within 1 year. And so our conclusion is that in unvaccinated children and children with underlying medical conditions, they are at higher risk of getting neuro-COVID or serious complications due to COVID-19. Common long COVID symptoms in children include anxiety, cognitive problem, fatigue, altered taste and smell, and cardiorespiratory symptoms. And our preliminary findings show that children with history of COVID perform worse on the processing speed compared to uninfected children. And we are conducting ongoing study to understand more of the neurobiological basis of COVID-related brain fog and the long-term implications on brain health in children. Thank you.
Thank you for your nice presentation. Let's continue with Roberto. Roberto?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah,
Please share your
yes,
screen.
I will. Let me open my video. Hello, everybody. And now I will to share my screen. Hello.
Hello.
My screen. Then hello, everybody. First, apologize for my confusion. Really, I was confused with the time. I'm now in Europe, in Portugal, and excuse me for that, but I'm ready to show you my presentation about the Cuban longitudinal COVID-19 cohort project. I will not too deep into the neurotropism and neurovirulence of the SARS-CoV-2. Only I want to explain about the sharing of physiopathological mechanism between the COVID-19 and brain disorder, specifically neurodegenerative disorder. Then it is a very important problem for our countries in the term of the possible putative apparition of neurodegeneration in the next years. Members of the Global Brain Consortium recently published in this journal an statement about the need of make researchers in the management of the COVID-induced brain dysfunction, assessing both the social and psychological mechanisms and the structural brain changes that are related with these disorders. In Cuba, similar to other countries, all countries, we suffer from the COVID-19 pandemic, mainly during the 2021, during the Delta wave, as you can see in this graph. And in response to this problem, there was a government mission to our institution and other institutions that belong to the National Program of Neuroscience and Technology to study the COVID-induced brain dysfunction in the Cuban survivors of COVID-19. We made this collaboration and open a scientific project that I know Professor Joel explained you some of these results, and I will now present you some of the design and main results of the study. This was designed as a longitudinal study in which we planned to include around 100 COVID-19 convalescent subjects and sex, age, and education matched controls that were direct contacts of the positive subject, but the PCR of this control were negative. Then most of them were under the same stressful condition related with the possibility or not to be infected, and therefore the psychological basis of the psychological impact of the disease also influence on these subjects. In this study, we designed 2 years follow, including three assessments, 3 visits, the baseline, the second study, and the third study. We applied the standardized neurological questionnaire and a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation using a tablet-based neuropsychological method with several cognitive tests. We applied the schedule for clinical assessment in neuropsychiatry. The SCAN 2.1 is a clinical tool for the diagnosis of neuropsychiatric conditions, and we also performed the objective quantitative electroencephalogram. Now I show you the baseline features of all cohorts. As you can see, both the COVID-19 convalescent and control group were homogeneous in terms of the age, gender, education level. But in the case of the comorbidity, we observed that the group of COVID-19 convalescents had a more frequent, more than 3 comorbidity. You can see 13 out of the 97 subjects that we recruit had more than 3 distinct comorbidity versus only 1 in the control group. Regarding the COVID-19 severity, as you can note in the slide, we had a similar proportion between the asymptomatic and slight symptomatic COVID-19 subjects, but we recruited a reduced number of subjects that had severe COVID-19 who were in the intensive care units. Very rapidly, it's not my intention to deep here. We observed a neurological picture that Professor Joel showed you. I will not explain about that, but as you can see, we note an increase of the generalized anxiety, depressive symptoms, sleep disorders, and acute stress in all cohorts in comparison with the control. Nevertheless, we observe no important cognitive alteration in all cohorts. Regarding the EEG findings, the item response theory analysis that we conducted allow us to identify that the presence of diffuse slow activity and the focal abnormality is able to discriminate between the COVID-19 survivors and control groups, and the global analysis assessing the significant difference between both groups confirm this discriminatory power of this analysis. Also, we found significant focalized excess of delta, theta, and beta source in the COVID-19 cohort versus the control cohort, and we also apply the harmonized QEEG Riemannian method of the CETA score for the study of the COVID-induced brain disorder, obtain that using this harmonized CETA score compared with a historical database of EEG and also with all control group, we observe that there is a discrimination between 3 groups using this harmonized method. I hope Professor Yukin will also to deep into these results. Now I just do an introduction to our longitudinal project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we are going to try to reproduce Joel's presentation.
Okay.
Good morning. First of all, we want to thank the organizers for inviting us to the meeting. The paper we're going to present deals about the incidence of neurological manifestations associated to COVID-19 in a population of 2 municipalities of Havana City, Cuba. The paper was performed by researchers of the Cuban Institute of Neurology and Neurosurgery and the Cuban Center of Neurosciences. COVID-19 have already affected millions of people and is not yet over. At least half of those of them have suffered some type of a neurological problem. However, it is very striking that despite the paramount magnitude of this problem, the neurological manifestations of COVID-19 are not yet well characterized. There is a huge number of case reports and reviews, but really controlled studies are very scarce. This knowledge is essential to healthcare providers to determine the resources which are needed to address post-COVID-19 syndrome. Our study is aimed at describing the frequency and prevalence of neurological manifestations in Cuban convalescents of mild forms of COVID-19 in 2 municipalities of Havana City. To achieve our objectives, we studied 310 subjects. 190 were convalescents of mild forms of COVID, while 120 were control subjects. All of them permanent residents at the Playa and Plaza municipalities of Havana City. Approximately 60% suffered respiratory and some other symptoms or classics of the symptomatic phase of COVID-19, while approximately 40% didn't suffer any symptoms during the acute phase. We included all the convalescents who suffered mild COVID during the year 2020 and met our inclusion criteria. Standardized questionnaires, including 10 modules of questions, was applied to all the participants. That questionnaire includes several modules which look for the demographic and general data related to COVID-19, as well as for the neurological disorders, a large variety of neurological disorders, including headache, taste and smell disorders that in previous studies were demonstrated to be very common, as well as some other disorders like vision, hearing, motor, sensory, and autonomic disorders that had been previously less studied. Here you have in the blue square an example of how we created the questions and the interpretation that we made of some of them. For example, to the question of have you feel pain when touching or squeezing your muscles? We interpreted that a positive answer to that question might be interpreted as suffering the symptom myalgia. The survey was implemented on an application for the mobile phones and was applied to all the subjects by trained neurologists. We found no significant differences between our convalescents and control groups for gender, skin color, education, and age. The most frequently affected categories of neurological symptoms were sleep disorders, motor disorders, headache, dizziness, a wide variety of autonomic disorders, a small percentage of visual disorders, taste and smell problems, and some sensory disorders. In order to quantify how many different neurological symptoms on average suffered each of the Cuban convalescents, we created different categories based on the number of symptoms suffered by each patient. By analyzing this graphic, we can notice that 85% of the convalescents had at least one neurological symptom during or post the acute phase of the COVID-19, while only 15% of them didn't have any neurological symptoms. The highest percentage of subjects suffered between 1 and 10 symptoms. This graph and the next ones shows a comparison between the incidence of neurological manifestations in COVID convalescents in blue bars versus normal controls in orange bars. It is noticeable that the convalescents show a significantly increased incidence for all the displayed manifestations. The most prevalent disorders were headache, fatigue, and insomnia. Also, taste disorders, paresthesia, myalgia, cramps, and diarrhea were more prevalent in the convalescents as compared to controls. 10 to 20% of the convalescents showed a significantly increased incidence of taste and smell problems, visual disorders, cranial nerve disorders, including dizziness, ataxia, vertigo, motor and sensory complaints, and a wide variety of dysautonomias, including cardiac arrhythmias, pherostomy, neurally mediated syncope, and hypertension. In 5 to 10% of the convalescents, we found an increased incidence of a wide variety of minor hearing and balance, taste and smell, visual and language disorders. A very important issue was to evaluate how long persisted the neurological manifestations associated to COVID-19. Our data shows that the incidence of most neurological disorders decreases very rapidly after the acute phase of COVID-19. For example, analyzing headache, after 4 weeks, the percentage of people reporting headache is less than 20% of those that originally had that during the acute phase of the disease. The number of subjects with persistent neurological disorders 1 year after the acute phase of COVID-19 is very low, prevailing fatigue, sleep disorders, and some hearing and vision impairment. We have demonstrated that the more symptomatic was the acute phase of COVID-19, the higher were the number of neurological symptoms. On average, symptomatic patients tend to suffer between 7 and 8 neurological symptoms, while asymptomatics suffered between 4 and 5 neurological symptoms. It means that even patients with asymptomatic variants of COVID did also develop some neurological symptoms. On the other hand, we've demonstrated a trend in relation to the age and the number of neurological symptoms, in a way that the older were the convalescents, the higher tended to be the number of neurological symptoms, although this relationship was not statistically significant. This meta-analysis, published in 2021, summarized the results of the most important papers published on long-term effects of COVID-19. Note that neurological disorders are among the most common post-COVID manifestations. Our results, shown in blue squares, are very similar to those reported in previous papers, with 80% of the convalescents having at least one neurological symptoms after the acute phase of COVID-19. From the analysis of our data, we may conclude that the incidence of neurological manifestations is significantly higher in convalescents of COVID-19 than in the general population, which had not been previously demonstrated, at least in our environment. The prevalence of most symptoms declines over a period of a few weeks or months. COVID-19 induces a wide variety of neurological symptoms, suggesting that both central and peripheral nervous system regions are affected. The frequency and prevalence of these disorders is influenced by several variables, like virus variants, comorbidities, vaccination, previous exposition to the virus, Therefore, these figures may be highly variable even within the same population. A detailed characterization and long-term follow-up might be needed to further understand the pathophysiology of neurological disorders associated to COVID-19. Finally, we want to thank the team of neurologists who applied the surveys in the community and all the volunteers who agreed to participate on the study. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, now we can continue with Benjamin.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I'm from the Brain Connectivity Lab of UESTC, and today I would like to share with you an important study that is related to COVID. As we all know, during the COVID time, WHO came up with several measures, and one of the measures were to encourage members to wear masks. And this measure was to prevent the person-to-person spread of the virus. But as time went on, there were several concerns, and these concerns were primarily related to physiological stress, such as some people said they were not comfortable wearing a mask and that it interfered with normal daily life. But as researchers, one thing that was important for us, especially for those of us in fMRI, was that some claimed that the wearing the mask made breathing difficult. And so in this case, we were thinking, okay, so if it makes breathing difficult, then it has to do with the carbon dioxide and oxygen ratio between your face and then the mask. So the important question that we're asking was that as gradually several facilities started resuming, most people or most researchers require, or centers require that subjects wear masks during scanning. So we wanted to find out, my team and I wanted to find out what, apart from the physiological changes, are there equal neurological changes in the brain? Now, prior to what we did, there were some studies that came up closer related to what we were also doing. In their study, they applied sensory motor task to find out whether the changes in the oxygen and carbon dioxide ratio can affect the activation of the brain. And this study found out that there were actually no changes in the activation. However, there were changes in the carbon dioxide ratio that they measured. So it meant that although there may be changes there may be physiological changes, the neuronal changes are not evident. So we also wanted to ask this question that, well, the results that we saw in the previous paper, could it change if we increase we give more cognitive demanding tasks? Because in the previous research, they were only concentrating on sensory motor tasks. And the second question was that if we increase the sample, would it increase the power of the analysis? So in the end, we came up with this framework you see on the right. So basically, we wanted to ask that if we increase the number of tasks or the cognitive tasks that is everyday life, would it bring about changes in the brain? So especially for both signals, So we had two approaches. One was to control the oxygen and carbon dioxide ratio using computer-paced breathing. The other was to allow subjects to breathe normally in the scanner. In the end, we went with self-paced breathing because we wanted the experiment to be as close to normal life as possible. And the masks that we were using were just the normal masks that we wear, like the surgical mask. So we recruited about 37 healthy young adults from the college or UESTC. And these are the experiments that we did. Actually, we included resting states just to use it as a baseline. For example, if you are not doing anything in the scanner, but you are wearing the mask, would it cause some neuronal changes or brain activation? We specifically chose finger tapping, emotional face recognition, and working memory, just because these tasks are closer to everyday life, what we do, and they are simple to mimic. And so with these experiments, our intention was to use whole brain activation. However, we also thought that maybe because we have a priori knowledge of certain areas that are activated when you are engaged in finger tapping or emotional recognition and working memory, we know these areas, so we wanted to zoom down by using ROI analysis. So this is basically our experimental route. So for example, if you come to the scanning center and you are not wearing a mask, you will have your O2 or oxygen saturation measured, and then you enter the scanner and perform your experiment. After you are done, your oxygen saturation is also measured, just to find out when you enter, during the time that you enter the scanner and the time that you got out, whether there are changes. And then this same subject goes in again, but then the experiment is randomized. So that means that when you come to the center and you are wearing a mask, you go through the system and then you take off the mask and go to the system again, just for us to find out if you wear the mask for a long time and then we scan your brain and you take it off for some time, whether there will be some brain activation changes. Now, we conducted all the analysis and we found out that for our results, there were no significant changes between wearing a mask and without wearing a mask during the scanning. But however, although we saw some few activations somewhere, these activations were not significant enough to show that there were indeed changes between wearing a mask and then without wearing a mask in the scanner. So as you can see on the right for the functional connectivity, you cannot see it clearly, but we saw that there is some attenuation of connectivity. And then on the left, you can also see some few attenuations on the mask on. But then these also were not significant. Now, on the level of the task, which was very, very important for us, we also realized that for all these tasks, there were no significant changes between when you are wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. And these results somehow resonated with the previous result from Christian Law. Now, surprisingly, when we did the ROI analysis, we were expecting that the power will increase. However, we saw that still there were no significant difference between wearing a mask and then without wearing a mask, although you can see the magnitude in between wearing a mask and not wearing a mask, but these changes were not statistically significant. So what does this tell us? It tells us that, of course, when you wear the mask, there will be changes in the carbon dioxide and oxygen ratio between your face and then the mask. However, these may not produce any significant changes in your brain activity. And we realize also that for both resting state and then task, when you wear the mask, there's a little bit of attenuation, but these attenuations were not statistically significant, meaning that when you wear the mask, when we are required to wear a mask during scanning, it does not affect the results that we get as compared to those not wearing a mask. Now, however, after the analysis, or through all the analysis from the design to the analysis, we realized certain challenges. So we somehow thought that the recommendations would be that how if we have different forms of mask, because in our analysis, in our experiment, we use surgical mask. And how about if you use different kind of masks like the N9 and the other ones? How about if we use those ones, will we see some changes? Also, in our experiment, the wearing of the mask was short. So we also think that if we wear the mask longer, we will see significant carbon dioxide and oxygen ratio change in the brain, and this could affect the brain activity. So in the end, we have shown that actually wearing the mask, when you are required to wear a mask during the scanning, our researchers in MRI should not be afraid or should not worry about brain activation when they are subject to wear the mask. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your nice presentation. Let's go with Daniel.
Yeah. So
Can
I
you
need to
share
share
your
my
screen?
screen. Yeah, I think Benjamin has to stop sharing his screen. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so you can see my presentation?
Yep, looks good.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I would like to present our findings on the long-term impact of COVID-19, focusing on cognitive impairment and neuropsychiatric symptoms in the post-COVID syndrome, which we conducted at the University Hospital of Cologne, where I am a PhD student. And I will first show you the results of our first study, which was the baseline assessment of cognitive impairment and neuropsychiatric symptoms in our cohort of patients with the post-COVID syndrome. After that, I will show you the first results of our 6 months follow-up. And last, I want to introduce a network perspective on those symptoms in the post-COVID syndrome. So for the first paper, which is the baseline paper, you can find the paper if you scan the QR code, which you can find here or in the top right corner of the next slides. And the goal for the study was that we wanted to characterize the neuropsychological profile of 52 patients that experienced persistent symptoms for at least 3 months after a mild to moderate course of COVID-19, and which reported subjective cognitive deficits. And our first question was if we were able to confirm these subjective deficits as objective impairment by neuropsychological testing. And second, we wanted to explore the associations between cognitive and neuropsychiatric symptoms, as they often occur together. And for that, we applied extensive neuropsychological testing in the domains of memory, attention, executive functioning, language, and perceptual motor function, and also applied cognitive screening tests to compare with the extensive neuropsychological testing. And we also assessed neuropsychiatric symptoms, namely fatigue, depression, anxiety, sleep quality, daytime sleepiness, and health-related quality of life by self-rating scales. And what we found is that we were able to confirm the objective impairments in 60% of our cohort, which reported subjective cognitive deficits, with 50% of the patients showing a minor neurocognitive disorder, which is like a minor cognitive impairment, and about 10% even showing a major neurocognitive disorder. And I already mentioned before that we also applied cognitive screening tests, namely the Montreal Cognitive Assessment and the Mini Mental State Examination. And we found that they only detected cognitive impairment in 25% of the patients for the MOCA, and only in one patient at all for the Mini Mental. So we need extensive neuropsychological testing to reliably detect cognitive impairments in post-COVID instead of cognitive screening tests. When we look at domain-specific impairments, we see that impairments are prevalent across all assessed domains, and the majority of patients showed impairments in more than one cognitive domain. And the focus here lies on memory and executive functioning, and you could also count attention here as another focus of impairment. When looking at the neuropsychiatric symptoms, we found high levels of symptoms overall. So they were in all of those several symptoms that we assessed, they were often above the cutoff that indicated clinical relevance. But what is interesting, though, is that we found no differences in the severity of these symptoms when we compared patients that showed minor versus major versus no neurocognitive disorder, except for daytime sleepiness. And we also found no differences when comparing these groups in socio-demographic variables like age, gender, years of education, or the premorbid IQ. And we also found no group differences regarding the time between COVID-19 and the neuropsychological assessment. So we can conclude that even though the neuropsychiatric symptoms are often clinically relevant, the association with cognition is quite unclear. And regarding the time, we need prospective research to really describe the trajectory of the symptoms. And that's why we did a 6-month follow-up with 41 patients of the initial cohort. As a disclaimer, I will talk about, and the results, I will talk about the 41 patients, even when comparing baseline and follow-up results, then the results for the baseline is still for the 41 patients here, to compare really those the same patients over the time points. The manuscript for this is in preparation, so it's not published. But yeah, if you're interested, you could follow me on Twitter. I would inform you when it's published. So what we found in the follow-up is that the rate of neurocognitive disorder dropped from about 60% to 35%. And also we found improvement in a global cognition score, which consists of all the neuropsychological testing that we applied. But we found no interaction effect between time and neuropsychological profile, meaning that although it might look like it's a little bit here, it's not the case that those patients that showed neurocognitive disorders at baseline improved over the course of 6 months more than the patients that showed no neurocognitive disorder at baseline. And the focus here still lies on memory, attention, and executive functioning. when looking at the neuropsychiatric symptoms and the comparison between baseline and follow-up, we found no differences in most of the symptoms, except we found improved quality of life over the 6 months. And we also tried to predict the change in the global cognition score between baseline and follow-up. And we were able to do so with anxiety assessed at baseline, but it was not helpful at trying to predict whether a patient will be showing a neurocognitive disorder at follow-up, or if he will be showing no cognitive disorder. So to conclude, there are less improvements in the neuropsychiatric symptoms than they are in the cognitive functioning. And the association between the neuropsychiatric and cognitive symptoms remain rather unclear. And as this association remains unclear, I would like to introduce a network perspective on the relationship between cognitive and neuropsychiatric symptoms in the post-COVID syndrome. And this perspective is actually based on the network theory of mental disorders, which was proposed by Borsboom in 2017. And the idea here is that COVID might lead to first symptoms. So COVID might lead to fatigue because you're feeling sick and you're feeling tired and you're experiencing fatigue. And the assumption here is that these symptoms may be causally connected to each other. So fatigue will lead to sleeping disorders, and maybe sleeping disorders will lead to cognitive disorders that we can measure. But also, the network is able to sustain itself by feedback loops. When fatigue leads to sleeping disorders, and sleeping disorders leads to depressions, for example, and the depression in turn leads to fatigue, then the symptoms persist over time, even though COVID has no direct impact on these symptoms anymore, because COVID is cured. And this has many advantages. This explanation, for example, how some symptoms may even newly develop in the post-COVID syndrome when they were not even present at the acute phase of COVID-19. And also, it's a great explanation for patients that experience mild to moderate courses of diseases, because in this model, it is more, or the strength between the symptoms are more important than the severity of initial symptoms. And we can also generalize this explanation to many other conditions, like maybe the post-vax syndrome, or for example, similar conditions after other viral infections. And I would like to finish my talk with some key points that I would like you to remember. So first of all, cognitive impairment and neuropsychiatric symptoms are common in the post-COVID syndrome, and they are often clinically relevant. And we need extensive neuropsychological testing instead of cognitive screening tests to reliably detect those cognitive impairments. When looking at the trajectory of symptoms, patients seem to improve in the cognitive performance, but the neuropsychiatric symptoms remain quite stable. And to shed further light on the association between cognition and neuropsychiatric symptoms, we will need psychological explanations like the network perspective that I proposed that complement neurological mechanism, because post-COVID syndrome and its symptoms are very complex and multifactorial. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Daniel, for this interesting talk. We have one question here. Maybe you can give a very quick answer to this, because I just see the question in the chat here. Then we have Edson asking, is it all about the weakest chain? So basically, as far as I see, it's probably the weakest link that breaks in this network perspective between the different symptoms that you showed.
I would not say it's about the weakest chain. So the strength of the connections are very important to get a stable network. So it's not like I don't know, the first symptoms. So I understand the question like the first symptom induced by COVID is the weakest chain, and that will lead to other symptoms. I think that's not the case. So it's rather than the connections between the symptoms have to be very strong.
I see we have Edson here. Edson, would you like to just formulate the question a bit more specific, maybe? I think that could help.
I just getting through, that's because of the beginning of the session, just only the breakout room. That's why I just type it. Thank you very much for giving me time to speak. The problem is, yes, about the long COVID, like cancers and the other diagnostic problems or dementia, if the stress position just affects us, it just makes much more early ages. Like what? Let's think that the person can have Alzheimer's diseases at over 75 years old. If it is about to just get into a stress like living alone or losing relatives and so on, the diagnosed age just comes a little bit early. But for another person with the same reasons, it could be let's say stomach cancer, not Alzheimer's disease. That was the thing that I'm just asking. If we are talking about the long COVID, if the patient is predisposed to, let me say fatigue, or let me say sleep disorder, will we see this weakest change on the effect of COVID-19? Maybe the person will be something else like myasthenia gravis or the other autoimmune diseases or dementia.
So I'm not really sure if I still understand the question. Is it like, so you're asking if, sorry, I don't know, could you please repeat the question? Or
I'm just asking that if the individual has got some predisposition for the symptoms that you have seen, and is it about this? Yeah.
Yeah, I think predispositions are really important here because that's something that's not specifically for post-COVID or long COVID. So a person that has a predisposition maybe for showing these symptoms, then these symptoms might be more interconnected. So it's more probable to show long COVID symptoms. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Do we have further questions?
Yeah, I think Claudio would like to.
Compliments for this session. It was very, very clear with very clear message. I have two questions. One for the first speaker concerning the relation between the EEG, the mediation effect of EEG between COVID and psychiatric or symptoms of long COVID. But he introduced the concept of the pre-COVID chronic diseases and the importance of before COVID diseases in interacting with the infection. So if you can explain how the pre-COVID can affect the mediation effect of the brain between infection and the post-COVID symptoms. I didn't capture this from the model. And for the last speaker, if can explain how the stress disorder during the COVID infection in relation to fear or trauma, mental trauma, can explain part of the symptoms in long term.
So I think the first question was for you, Kin. Annie, is Yukin still there? I'm not quite sure. I don't see him. The second question was it for Daniel, maybe? For the last speaker? Okay, Daniel, maybe you can start answering, and I'm trying to see if the speaker with the EEG data is still there. Oh, okay. Then who wants to start? Maybe Daniel, because you already answered before and you're the last speaker. Maybe you could start first with the answer and then you can take over.
Yeah, so first of all, what's very important, and maybe also that was part of the former question, is that the explanation for or the network perspective is part of the network theory of mental disorders, and you can explain most of the mental disorders like trauma and anxiety, fear with this theory. So it's definitely possible that also other aspects play a role here and can contribute to the development of the symptoms in long COVID, which lead to the neuropsychiatric and cognitive symptoms and the post-COVID syndrome.
Thank you.
I think, do we have Yukin here? I'm not quite sure. Maybe the connection is not so stable.
King?
Okay, well, it's also nearly 1 in China, so maybe it's also a bit late for this question for him. I think let's see if
Ben, you can ask the question. The team is here. Okay.
The team is here. Claudio, maybe you can repeat the question. So it was about the EEG data and about the mediation effect.
Yeah. It mainly explain the reasonable mediation effect of the brain between the infection and the post-COVID psychiatric symptoms, and this was expected, of course. But the very important part of his talk was about the importance of a pre-infection chronic diseases in the interaction with the infection, COVID infection. No, but I didn't capture in the statistical mediation model how the pre-infection condition enters.
Okay, so actually this study was done in 2 parts. First, a part was seeing what was the premorbid conditions, how they affected post-morbid conditions, age. There was a number, so it was a preliminary where the EEG was not considered. Okay, that allowed us to eliminate a series of factors, and then in the second, we found that there was one factor which really summarized, and that once you included it, which is this, let's say, this severity of COVID, once you include it, you didn't need a number of other factors, and that is the one that then we did the mediation analysis. So this is actually 2 analyses, one to see which were the important factors, but keeping the EEG out and then including it again in the model. We can share, for those that are interested, this is actually, Claudio, we're going to be seeing more of this at the International Organization for Psychophysiology, okay? We're presenting, and Yu King is going to present. So we can share these results. We're going to get a preprint and a publication out, but it's a two-stage analysis. Now, one of the things that wasn't that, we didn't see very sensitivity, no, it was premorbid psychiatric syndromes. And why? Because the number of people that had it in this sample was very low. So what we're moving towards is a Bayesian analysis where we can pull in the amount of enormous information that there is, you know, that will then merge with the particular data we have. So what we're moving to, and Foulet, who has been the leader in all this of mediation and causation, no? She is now looking with the team on how to include not only data that's available from the sample, but data that informs us from larger studies. Okay, so that's
okay. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you. Okay. My suggestion is try to unify the two parts of the analysis in order to have a model able to explain the effect on the mediation of the premorbid condition, because otherwise the mediation effect of the brain between the infection and symptoms, the long COVID symptoms, can be perceived as obvious.
Yes, but one thing you have to see is that what we did to protect us in the second part was to look at sensitivity analysis. That is to say, we looked at possible confounders that we had left out. And the interesting thing is that here, the EEG explains 99% of the mediation effect, which is really surprising. And second, it is so robust, which this was one of the slides that Yu King presented. It is very robust to unmeasured confounders. Now, that doesn't say that what you're saying is not a good idea. It's on the contrary, it's a very good idea. Okay? So
thank you.
We can talk about it. We can talk about it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Is Christian Montag still there? Can you hear me, Christian?
Yes, I'm still there.
I would like to have a more general question for you that's maybe also not directly related to COVID, but you showed in your data very impressively that the rates of social media use, particularly under young people, are rocketing right now, and maybe driven by the COVID, but I think this is a general trend that we see. And actually we don't know, as you also showed, we currently don't know what this does with the brain, but we also see lots of other psychopathological difficulties. You know, like young people have, because of all of these filters in the internet, we have probably an increase in eating disorders and body dysmorphic disorders. We have probably this permanent competition. We have people there that lose maybe, as you also said, that then lose track with their education and things like that. So it's maybe an entire umbrella of negative consequences that could be there under strong, maybe excessive social media use under young people. How could this be? Do you see what needs to happen to basically counteract this, or how can we do better?
Yeah.
Because in the end, all of these platforms are built to keep people online, to keep them engaged. How can we restructure that? What could be a good way? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's time to restart social media and think of new ways of how these platforms operate, because I mean, we have seen in the past that we basically follow the narratives of the industry. Perhaps you all remember that the industry put forward a time well spent initiative. So Meta provided users with a chance to have an online alarm clock where you can say, okay, I don't use the platform for more than half an hour, or you all have screen time on the from Apple. But from my view, this is just marketing. This is basically they copy the strategies from the nicotine and alcohol industry to do victim blaming in the end, to say, well, see, we are not the problem. Guys, we give you a super cool feature and then all will be good. So I think it's it's really time, and we did a commentary also on addiction. We really need to have different narratives now, not only point to the individual users, but we need to get rid of the data business model, because as long as the tech companies, as Ben, as you said, earn their money via prolonging our online time, via immersive platform design, we will not really tackle the problems around internet use disorders in this field, because the industry is very strong and they did a lot of years A/B testing. They know exactly how to capture the attention of young minds with their developing brains. And I think this goes along also with a clear call for action, namely this field is surprisingly understudied when we talk about the underlying neurobiological mechanisms. There are just a handful of good social media studies out there using MRI, for instance. There has been one in JAMA Pediatrics, I think now, which is quite nice, where they observed in a longitudinal design how the brain's changes from 13 to 15, when I remember correctly, when in the context of reward sensitivity. But we need way more efforts, because we know that these user groups are vulnerable, and just to do questionnaire research in this field is clearly a limitation. And but this said, Ben, I think we need to get rid of the data business model, and we need to think about perhaps social media being a public good, and we think of creating completely new platforms.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, I think it's all in the nature of the systems, because it's just, and although meanwhile the machine learning algorithms who stand behind this, although for things like this short video platforms, they just try to optimize your time that you spend online, and they're very good in this. They're getting very much better by day, because they can learn more and more. So it's really a very interesting question. And as you said, we don't know how much this affects the young brain particularly, and how this can change. Okay, so do we have further questions? I think maybe we have time for one final question, if we have one.
I just can say, Ben, from my side, thank you so much for organizing this. It was really a pleasure to hear all your talks. I learned a lot, and hope to see many of you in person in the near future.
Okay, thanks very much. I think that's a good bridge to my thank you to everyone, to all of the speakers who came in, but also to the technical team, Annie and Carlos, who did a very good job, that everything ran very smooth. I'd like to thank all speakers. As Christian mentioned, hope to see you soon in the future. And again, thanks to Pedro and for Alan for organizing this and bringing this Global Brain project forward. Okay, then, thanks very much, and have a good night, good evening, and good afternoon.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.